$590 million. That's how much Johnson & Johnson, along with the three largest U.S. drug distributors, paid to Native American tribes in February 2022. Native American representatives accused pharmaceutical companies of being behind the so-called opioid crisis.
Opioid use disorder patients.
According to them, these companies pressured doctors to overprescribe addictive narcotic painkillers. Native Americans, particularly vulnerable due to their unique immune responses, were 9 times more likely to develop addictions, resulting in over 500,000 deaths and affecting an equal number of lives. That number is quite shocking, isn't it? You might think it's unfair, maybe even call it a crime against humanity. But consider this. How often do you think about what happened to the Native American tribes? Remember, everything that modern Americans enjoy today was once the homeland of Indian tribes, of which there were 2,500 before Europeans arrived. The very first contact between Native Americans and Europeans turned into a tragedy. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus and his crew landed on the Bahamian Islands, they encountered the Arawak tribe. The natives presented gifts, but the sailors took this friendly gesture as a sign of weakness and chose to enslave them. Columbus noted that the locals had no knowledge of weapons. When he showed them a sword, they mistakenly grasped it by the blade and cut themselves, not knowing its use. Columbus remarked that with just 50 men, he could conquer these people, who he believed would make good servants. It's safe to say, this was far from a favorable first encounter for the Native Americans. Columbus's exploration led him to Haiti, where he established the Spanish colony of Hispaniola and enforced a tribute on the indigenous population. The locals were made to sift for gold nuggets in rivers, trading them with the Europeans for a copper token as a sign they had paid their tax. Those who failed to secure a token suffered severe punishment, having their hands and legs savagely cut off. Over time, Europe buzzed with stories about a continent overflowing with riches and inhabited by harmless Native Americans. Sounds appealing, right? The English found the idea appealing too. They arrived in 1620 aboard the Mayflower, docking in what is now Massachusetts and establishing the Plymouth settlement. Initially, the Europeans avoided conflict with the natives. However, as the colony expanded, the settlers began eyeing the lands of the Pequot Native Americans. This growing tension eventually erupted into the Pequot War, nearly wiping out the tribe. The next part of the story might shock you. The conflict reached its peak when English settlers and their allies besieged a fortified Pequot village known as Mystic. On May 26, 1637, they launched an attack and set the entire village on fire, burning alive 400 men, women, and children. It's horrific, isn't it? How did the civilized European society react to these atrocities? Generally, there was hardly any reaction. Only a handful spoke up against it, including Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who vocally opposed the cruelty and exploitation of Native Americans. He fought for their rights and promoted peaceful Christianization rather than violent conquest. However, his efforts were largely ignored. The overwhelming majority of Europeans turned a blind eye, more interested in the profits and power the colonies could bring. How would you respond if invaders came to your homeland with such intentions? The Native Americans, in turn, resisted as fiercely as they could. However, when it came to military matters, the Native Americans were significantly outmatched by the battle-hardened Europeans. Put yourself in the shoes of a young Indian familiar only with the dog as a helper and companion, the turkey for food and feathers, and the llama for transporting goods in the mountains. Now, imagine the bewildering sight of a foreigner riding an imposing creature that was entirely new to you. The initial reaction would likely be one of shock. To the Native Americans, these powerful beasts, which the foreigners mounted, appeared to possess supernatural qualities, causing them to react with superstitious fear. These mysterious creatures were, indeed, horses. Additionally, the introduction of firearms, previously unknown to them, horrified the natives. Yet, in the first half of the continent's conquest, their effect was limited due to the slow reload times of muskets. Native Americans used their greater numbers to their advantage, often overpowering the musketeers with volleys of arrows and securing victories. Furthermore, as they learned to use firearms and ride horses themselves, the pace of colonization was slowed. By the first quarter of the 17th century, only about 2,000 Europeans had settled in North America. What do you think allowed the Europeans to gain the upper hand? Upon Christopher Columbus's arrival, Native Americans began suffering from diseases they had never faced before, characterized by intense malaise, coughing, and later, red skin spots that developed into pustules, leading to a slow and painful death. These were the effects of measles and smallpox, brought to America by Europeans who had developed immunity over centuries of exposure. For the natives, however, these diseases were deadly. As the Europeans witnessed the devastating impact on Native Americans, they quickly understood the strategic advantage they held. Realizing the potential to conquer indigenous peoples swiftly and with minimal losses, they began to deliberately deploy measles and smallpox as exceptionally effective biological weapons against the local tribes. During the siege of Fort Pitt in May 1763 by Chief Pontiac and his Ottawa tribe, General Jeffrey Amherst turned to a devious tactic. He commanded the gathering of blankets used by smallpox patients and sent them to the besieging Native Americans under the guise of a peace offering. As you can guess, the outcome was swift and devastating. The tribes, weakened by ongoing epidemics, could not resist effectively. They watched in helpless despair as the bold newcomers constructed their settlements and pushed deeper into the continent. However, the hardships endured by the Native American people were far from over. After gaining independence, the United States immediately sought to expand its territory, targeting lands northwest of the Ohio River, inhabited by local tribes, including those tribes that had allied with the Americans during the war against Great Britain. Led by George Washington, the U.S. government anticipated a swift victory over these groups, whom they viewed as living in a primitive communal system. However, this conflict, known as the Northwest Indian War, stretched from 1785 to 1795, becoming the longest war in U.S. history until the Afghanistan invasion in 2001. You might think that after enduring such prolonged conflict, Native Americans would finally be left in peace. However, this was not the case. In 1825, a law was passed that resulted in natives losing their land rights when claimed by U.S. citizens, setting the stage for the forced relocations that began 5 years later. These relocations moved large tribes to poor and empty lands, and by 1867, to reservations in barren areas near the Canadian border. Even though treaties originally gave Native Americans certain lands, the discovery of gold or other valuable resources often led to white settlers pushing Native Americans to sign new treaties that were less favorable to them. But unfortunately, their sufferings were not limited to this. In a chilling example of local policy, some municipalities offered bounties for the killing of Native Americans. For instance, in 1855, a city in Northern California officially offered a $5 reward for the head of a Native American. To claim this gruesome bounty, one had to present the actual scalp of the deceased. That's just horrifying. Any ideas on what might have shifted American attitudes to be more favorable towards Native Americans? World War I. Many Americans hesitated to cross oceans and lay down their lives for national pride. Yet, Native Americans, who weren't even recognized as citizens in their own homeland, courageously signed up to fight. You might wonder, given all the atrocities committed against them, why would they volunteer to help? The truth is, despite their lands being occupied by outsiders, Native Americans continued to see these places as their own. Proud and passionate about freedom, defending their lands was not just a duty, but an honor. Among their notable contributions to World War I was the work of the Code Talkers. While they're more famous for their role in World War II, their unique languages were used by the US military during World War I to transmit messages secretly, ensuring they remained a mystery to enemy forces. After thousands of Native Americans sacrificed their lives in World War I, American society began to seriously reconsider the status of its native residents. This led to the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, which granted them the rights of US citizens. Today, the descendants of once numerous Native American tribes primarily reside on reservations. Astonishingly, less than 2% of the original Native American populations of North America survive. Historian David Stannard points out that the conquest of the New World resulted in more deaths than the Holocaust. Stannard supports the genocidal theory and elaborates on this in his book, American Holocaust, where he describes the deliberate extermination of about 100 million Native Americans by European colonists. Back in 2009, the US Congress made an official apology to Native Americans for the long history of violence, mistreatment, and neglect they faced from US citizens.